Welcome to the next edition of our Fellowship series, and this time we paint the Chuck Norris of the elven world, Legolas. To start off, the miniature was given a spray of Army Painter Army Green, as we are going to be painting a fair bit of green today. I'm going to start off with a few older paints from the Army Painter range, as I just like the colours. So in the video, these will be shown with this older looking graphic, and when using the newer Fnatic paints, they will be shown with the newer graphics like this. Crypt Wraith was the initial colour for our elven tunic, and for the middle section, this is going to be a more mucky greeny brown. So I'll show you how to alter that colour later on without mixing various paints up. Elven Green was the base coat for this, and for his shoulder flaps? Deep Blue Ocean was the colour of choice for his trousers, or maybe leggings, or no, let's say tights, just like these merry gentlemen. With the initial base coats, I'm not going to be too precise when putting them on. And it doesn't matter if some colour gets onto an area that we haven't painted yet. For me, it's just quicker this way, and we can layer the paint of the latter colours as we go. So getting some ash grey paint here onto the wrist guard, for example, is okay. Continuing on with some woodland colours, of course we are going to have brown on the miniature. And we'll paint this in a few ways so you can take back some ideas for your collection at home. Maybe you may have some Mirkwood pointed-eared folk to paint up as well. Hands up in the comments if you do. As I've got the newer Fnatic paints now, I'll try some different skin colours and see what they are like. And Moonstone Skin was the base coat for Leggy today. And Chuck Leggy Norris fact number 1 of the day is, he's so light of foot he can even walk on snow without sinking in. Like some sort of elvish ninja cat. For his fair elven hair, gargoyle grey was the initial colour, and we'll turn this into a soft light blonde look later on. The weapons such as the dagger handles and the bow will have a brighter yellowy brown colour to start with, and we'll have a slight gradient of these to make them look a bit more interesting. The last little details left to base coat were mainly on the back, with the arrows and the quiver to finish off. He's one of those members from the Fellowship set that has a little bit more detail to get through, so it makes him quite an interesting miniature to paint up. This paint of true copper was used not only for the filigree detail on the quiver, but it was also applied to the tips of the bow. That brings us to the end of the base coating stage. I'll be working on a couple of areas at the same time for the next few stages, as we'll be using washes and they take a little bit of time to dry. So we can go back and forth on these areas to speed things up. Using a couple blue washes first for the tights and the shirt to add some shade. They were both highlighted afterwards with a couple of colours each. A dungeon grey paint was used for the highlights on the tights rather than a blue, as this made the colour a bit more desaturated looking, so it would dull the overall colour down slightly. And a little note here that the new Fnatic Blue Tone wash has a much more subtle finish than the old Blue Tone, which makes it excellent for shading white clothing. Onto the green tunic now. And as we mentioned before, we are going to alter the central section, and we'll do this through a mid-brown wash. This will basically add a thin filter over our base coat paint. This was also added to the shoulders as well. Whilst the main part of the tunic, as well as the feather fletchings on the arrows, were given a military shade wash. Chuck Leggy Norris fact number 2 of the day is, he can sleep and have wonderful elvish dreams, maybe about Tauriel, and still be able to walk at the same time. Now that's multitasking. If only you could sleep and paint simultaneously. Think of all the extra armies that you could finish in your lifetime. With these wash paints now dry, one more layer of mid-brown was added onto the inner section to darken it further. And using washes like this can give you more ways to create colour options when you are painting your miniatures. And you don't have to mix random paints together or remember ratios. A thin down black was added to give some extra shading and separate the two green areas of the tunic as well as the belt for later on. This is fairly useful if you want to create more depth on a miniature, and I use this little trick fairly often as I paint. Now onto my favourite stage, and that is highlighting. But Chris, why is this your favourite stage, I hear you ask? Well, my wonderful and inquisitive viewer friend, I like this stage as it gives me satisfaction knowing that each part I paint now will complete the miniature. And it's now the downhill slope to the end, bringing this little bit of toy plastic to life. This section was highlighted with a khaki looking ochre colour, which will make it nicely different from the rest of the green tunic. And we'll move on to that next. Army green was the colour of choice for the highlights, and this was painted onto the folds of the cloth as well as the bottom of the tunic. 𝗏𝗏 Norris fact number 3 of the day is, this dude can drink alcohol like it's a cup of Sunny D. Gimli never stood a chance. After the army green was used as a highlight, some war paint stabilizer was added and mixed on the palette. This gave us a diluted down version of the paint, which was then placed onto the lower part of the tunic to create a lighter looking cloth. And finally, this was finished off with an olive drab highlight. I don't go over the entirety of the previous highlight, just focusing more towards the bottom of the cloth, but also around the darkened area that we painted previously to set this apart a little bit more. And whilst we still had the paint out, it was used to highlight the feather fletching on the arrows. Now onto his buttery smooth elven skin. He was given a soft skin wash, or just use flesh wash if you still have that paint in your collection, and this was smothered onto the flesh. Once that was dry, the eye sockets were then picked out with a dark brown, ready to paint the eyes later on. I used some thin down carnelian skin paint to create a form of a wash, and this was used as an extra layer of shade to give him a more reddish looking hue, especially in between his fingers and on his cheeks. Afterwards, his tiny little eyes were painted with a character brush using an off-white colour, such as company grey here. Now the sculpted face is particularly small, so just take your time with the eyes and oh sweet gummy Jesus, he looks like the bookstore owner from Top Secret! Let's go ahead and fix that. If you have ever painted a wonky eye, then just go back in with the dark brown, here Brigandine brown, and then the skin colour was placed back over it to give it a bit more normality. Which brings me to 𝗏𝗏 Norris fact number 4. He can see the details of rapidly moving horsemen from 5 leagues away, which would make him great for a game of I Spy. After giving the rest of the skin a quick tidy layer of moonstone, a couple more skin paints were applied to give a lighter appearance, especially ruby skin at the end to highlight the facial features and the knuckles on his hands. His hair is pretty fair, like a majestic looking pooch on a L'Oreal advert. So we shall add a subtle wash of light tone to give it a darker look in the shaded areas. But if you would like more of a yellowy blonde look, then I have a video for that in the short section of the channel also. But for more on the lighter side of things, the initial gargoyle paint was added to tidy up with a first highlight, and then Great Hall Grey was used for the final highlight. Just use your fine detail brush for this and try to pick out the strands of hair sculpted onto the miniature. Now, onto the weapons. The dagger handles, as well as the bow, were given a soft tone wash to give them a darker shaded look. and the daggers had a single highlight of troll claws to finish them off. Whilst the bow had a further brown paint added towards the middle section to darken it even further. But we are going to create a gradient here to give this old model a little bit more interest. And we did that with some thinned down desert yellow paint. This just helped the transition between our shaded areas and our original base coat colour. This is just a fun way to create some more visual interest on those wooden weapons for your fantasy miniatures. 𝗏𝗏𝗏 fact number 5. He is so good that he can kill a Nazgul's mount flying high in the sky with his trusty bow and arrow with ease. Oh, and did I mention he can do that in the dark? To finish off the bow, a few fine highlights of Tomb King Tan, say that 10 times in a row, were painted on down the length of the wood. And I think it enhanced the overall look of the gradient as well. Bonza. The leathers were next, and they had a splattering of strong tone wash applied to them. This covered the boots as well as the wrist guards, and we also did the metals at the time to save time. Once completely dry, a couple lighter browns were used to highlight these areas. I tend to normally go for a double highlight when painting miniatures. The first acts as a mid-tone colour, whilst the latter is a much brighter colour to go more on the edges of the sculpt. For bog standard troops, if you've got a lot to paint, then you could probably get away with one highlight, and that would be enough. But as Legolas is a main character, a little bit more time was taken with the mini. The second highlight of fur brown for the boots and the wrist guard was actually then used as a first highlight for the quiver and the straps. These will then have an additional lighter highlight placed on them to make them different from the previous browns, just to add a bit of variety. And the metals were given a brass highlight to pick out the filigree on the quiver, and the metal on the bow tips. And did you know, 𝗏𝗏𝗏 fact number 6 of the day, he's not only an expert marksman with his bow and arrow, but he also works well on a team. And because he's my favourite member of the Fellowship, he gets extra treatment. And some simple curly-whirly freehand was painted on the quiver and his woodland tunic to create more detail. That's the last of the tall folk finished for our Fellowship, and we just have Merry and Pippin to go. But I've somehow lost them. Legolas, where are those little scamps?
They're taking the hobbits to Isengard!